Welcome in, everyone, to another deep dive with yours truly. We're going to be looking at equitable player selection in youth volleyball today. We've got a really interesting mix of stuff to look at. We've got some articles, we've got coaching guides, and even some firsthand accounts from people in the thick of it. Should be a good one.
Yeah, sounds like a great mix. This whole idea of equitable selection, it's something that comes up all the time, but it's not always easy to define what it actually means in practice, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what we're here to figure out today. Like when we say equitable, it feels like you know, it's got to be more than just fair, right? There's got to be more to it than that.
For sure, for sure. I think when we're talking about equitable selection, we're really talking about recognizing that every player comes in with a different set of needs and a different starting point. So
Mhm.
yeah, obviously age and experience are huge factors, but
Okay.
we also need to think about skill level and a player's individual goals for the season, even the needs of the team as a whole. It's a lot to juggle.
Totally. So if you're a coach trying to put together a team, you've got this balancing act. You're trying to make things fair, but also trying to create an environment where everyone can actually improve. I mean, I can already see how this gets complicated.
It definitely does, and that's where these firsthand accounts and insider perspectives we've got really come into play. Like, in the Sport Coaching Internet Kids source, there was this point that really jumped out at me. They said that even something as simple as making every player bring their own volleyball to tryouts can be super telling.
Wait, really? Just bringing a ball is that big of a deal? What does that tell you? Like, are they just being prepared? I wouldn't have thought about that.
I know it seems small, but think about it for a second. It shows a level of commitment and responsibility right off the bat. And for coaches, those are things they're looking for from the very first interaction.
Okay, that's interesting. So you're saying tryouts are about way more than just like hitting the ball as hard as you can.
Yeah, 100%. And the comprehensive guide source really digs into this too. They talk about how coaches are looking at work ethic coachability, how a player interacts with their potential teammates. It's about the whole package, not just raw talent.
Right. And they also mentioned coaches are using rubrics now to evaluate players, which seems like a great way to make sure everyone's getting a fair shot.
Totally, because those rubrics allow you to assess a wider range of skills, right? Not just the flashy ones. So you're looking at communication sportsmanship, the ability to adapt to a new play, things that might get overlooked if you were just focusing on who scores the most points.
That makes a lot of sense. And it makes me think about another thing we saw in the coaching approaches source. They mentioned there are actual rules now that prevent coaches from favoring players who come from specific clubs or schools. It's all about creating that level playing field, right?
It is. And that focus on fairness, it's got to go beyond just tryouts.
Yeah.
We're talking about creating a culture of respect where every single athlete feels like they've got an equal opportunity to succeed. And that's at the heart of ethical coaching, putting the athlete's well-being first. And it's something that needs to be present throughout the entire season.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And speaking of tricky situations, what about when a coach is coaching their own kid? I mean, that's got to be tough. The Sport Coaching Internet Kids source had some thoughts on that too.
That's a real minefield, right? I think the key there is just open and honest communication. Parents, coaches, players, everyone needs to be on the same page about expectations and roles, especially when those lines can get a little blurred.
And the Coaching Approaches source actually had some pretty specific guidelines about this.
Hmm.
They even talked about stuff like transportation to games and social events. It's about avoiding even the appearance of favoritism, which can be so hard to navigate sometimes.
Absolutely. It's about having a system in place where every player feels valued and respected, regardless of whether or not they happen to share a last name with the coach. And that circles back to this concept of being equitable. It's not about one player, it's about the whole team dynamic.
Right, so we've got these tryouts, we've got ethical considerations, the parent factor, all these pieces of the puzzle. But how does a coach actually go about building a well-rounded team using all of these principles? I mean, how does that play out in the real world?
Well, the comprehensive guide source actually made a really great point about this. They said volleyball teams need more than just skilled players, right? You need hitters, setters, blockers, defenders. Each role has its own strengths, and you need a balance of all those strengths.
So you're saying it's not just about finding the six best players, it's about putting together a team where everyone can contribute in their own way.
You got it. And that's where this whole idea of equitable selection really comes to life. It's not just about filling slots. It's about understanding that different types of players can actually make the team stronger as a whole.
Man, this has already been so insightful, and I bet our listeners are hooked. ready to keep digging into this.
Let's do it. I think we're just getting started here. But it's not just about having different positions on the team. It's about having diversity within those positions, too.
Oh, okay. I like that. What do you mean by that?
Well, let's take hitters, for example. You wouldn't want a whole team of hitters who could only, like, smash the ball as hard as possible, you know? You need some finesse in there, too.
So you need different types of hitters, basically.
Course.
Some who can be powerful and some who can be more strategic.
Yeah, exactly. And the comprehensive guide source, they really emphasize that point. Like, ideally, you'd have hitters who can do those powerful line shots or cross-court shots, and then you also want some who can do those sneaky little tip shots that catch the other team off guard.
Like having different tools in your offensive toolbox.
Exactly right. And that same principle applies to other positions, too. You want setters who can run different offensive plays, defenders who are really good at reading the hitters and knowing where the ball's going to go. You need that variety.
Makes me think about those rubrics we talked about earlier. Like, coaches aren't just looking for players who are amazing at one specific thing. They're looking for players who can bring a whole range of skills to the team.
And that adaptability is huge, especially as players get more competitive and move up to higher levels. Remember those requirements we saw for the advanced hitting session at the Canadian Elite Academy?
Oh, yeah. Those were pretty intense.
Yeah.
I think you needed at least 2 years of high school or club volleyball experience, plus you had to complete a bunch of sessions at the lower levels. It wasn't something you could just jump into.
Exactly. And think about the questions they were asking potential participants. They went way beyond just like, can you hit the ball hard?
Yeah.
They were asking about awards, work ethic, even how players balance school and training. They wanted the full picture.
So they were really trying to get a sense of the athlete as a whole person, not just their volleyball skills.
100%. And that's another example of equitable selection in action, right? They're looking at potential and drive and the ability to contribute to a team environment. It's about more than just talent.
I see that. Okay, so let's say you've got this team full of players with diverse skills, good work ethic, positive attitudes. How does a coach actually make sure everyone is getting a chance to develop and, kind of shine in their own way?
Well, this is where practice design becomes super important. And there's a great story about this in the Sport Coaching Internet Kids source. This coach was running a defensive drill, and she realized that her assistant coach was the one getting all the reps.
Oh, yeah. I can see how that happens.
Yeah.
You're so focused on teaching the skill that you forget to actually let the players practice it.
Exactly. It was a real wake-up call for that coach. And it just shows how important it is to be really intentional about practice design. Like, coaches need to create drills that give every player quality touches on the ball and a chance to improve.
The comprehensive guide also had some suggestions about how often to train different skills at different ages. I thought it was interesting that they said elementary school players should mostly focus on basic motor skills and gameplay rather than specific positions.
That makes a lot of sense. Younger players need a strong foundation in the fundamentals before they start specializing in a certain role.
It's like building a house. You need a strong base before you can start adding all the fancy stuff.
I love that analogy. And it's so true for player development. A good coach is going to understand where each player is at in their development and create a plan that actually meets their individual needs, not just some cookie-cutter approach.
Right, so we've talked about diverse skill sets, the role of practice, design, the need for coaches to be really adaptable in their training approaches. It seems like equitable player selection really requires coaches to be thoughtful and intentional about every decision they make.
It absolutely does. But it's not just about the X's and O's of volleyball. It's about creating a positive team culture, setting clear expectations, and communicating effectively with players and parents throughout the whole season.
And it sounds like those ethical considerations we discussed earlier, they play a big role too.
Absolutely. Creating a level playing field, being transparent with players and parents, that's all part of equitable selection.
So we've established that equitable player selection is more than just picking the most talented players. But are there any, concrete examples of how this plays out in the real world? What are some challenges coaches face, and how do they actually approach those challenges?
Those are great questions. And I think it's the perfect time to move into the final part of our discussion, where we'll explore some real-world scenarios and see how those principles we've been talking about can be applied in practice.
All right, so we've talked about all these principles behind equitable selection. Now let's get into some real-world situations where these principles actually come into play. What are some tough decisions that coaches face when they're putting these ideas into practice?
Okay, so imagine this. You're a coach. You're down to the last spot on your team. and you've got two players who have very similar skill levels, but they bring very different things to the table. One player is a natural leader, really outgoing, maybe even a little bit of a goofball, the type that keeps the
Mhm.
team's energy up. The other player is much quieter, more reserved, but they're incredibly dedicated and hardworking. So how do you choose?
Oh, man, that's a tough one. It sounds like both players have qualities that could be really valuable to the team.
Exactly. And that's where those evaluation rubrics we keep talking about could be so helpful. They can help coaches make decisions in a more structured and objective way by considering those less tangible qualities alongside technical skills.
So it's not just about going with your gut feeling. It's about having an actual system in place to help you make these difficult decisions.
Right. A good rubric is going to prompt the coach to think about things like the overall needs of the team. Does this team need someone who's more vocal and can step up as a leader? Or would a quiet and steady presence be a better fit?
It's like you're trying to find the missing pieces of a puzzle.
Yeah.
You know, you need players who complement each other and create a really strong and cohesive team.
That's a great analogy. And speaking of tricky situations, let's not forget about the whole scenario where a coach has their own child trying out for the team.
Ooh, yeah, that's a tough one.
Mm.
The Sport Coaching Internet Kids source had some good advice about how to handle that.
Yeah, they really stress the importance of transparency and being upfront with everyone involved. The coach needs to communicate clearly with their child, with the other parents, and basically just make it crystal clear that favoritism is not going to fly.
They even suggested having another coach observe tryouts just to provide a neutral perspective, which I thought was a really smart idea.
It's all about protecting the integrity of the process and making sure that everyone feels like they're being treated fairly.
So let's say we fast forward a bit. The team has been chosen, roles are defined, everyone's ready to start the season. How does a coach make sure that this commitment to equitable selection continues throughout the season, especially when it comes to things like playing time?
Well, those core principles we talked about, fairness, individual growth, meeting the team's needs, those have to guide every decision the coach makes. A coach who truly believes in equitable selection is going to see playing time as an opportunity for players to develop, not just as a reward for being the most skilled player on the team.
The comprehensive guide talked a lot about creating a culture of continuous improvement, which I thought was a really interesting idea.
Yeah, it's all about shifting the focus from who's the best to how can we all get better? And that creates an environment where every player feels valued and is motivated to improve regardless of how much playing time they're getting.
So it's about fostering a love for the game and a desire to grow as a team rather than just being laser focused on winning at all costs.
Exactly. And when players are genuinely motivated to improve, even if they're not starting every game, they're more likely to be engaged and be supportive teammates. It really does benefit everyone in the long run.
So it's not just about being equitable during tryouts, it's about maintaining that philosophy throughout the entire season.
You got it. It's about creating a team culture where every player feels valued, challenged, and supported in their development, both as athletes and as individuals.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from defining equitable to exploring all the challenges that coaches face in youth sports. As we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main takeaway you hope our listeners are walking away with?
For me, the biggest takeaway is that equitable player selection is about so much more than just picking the most skilled players. It's about creating an environment where young athletes can learn, grow, and develop a genuine love for the game, regardless of their starting point.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it's definitely something worth striving for in all youth sports.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into equitable player selection in youth volleyball. We'll catch you next time.